Okay, first graphic here, winter weather advisory out for the greater Galena area here, and that's out until 9 p.m. Sunday, and that's for a snow advisory actually. 3 to 5 inches expected to fall overnight tonight and till 9 p.m. Tomorrow evening, Sunday evening. And then there's a wind chill advisory for the western Arctic coast and the eastern Arctic coast. And that's out until, let's see, 3 p.m. Sunday for gusty east and northeast winds, creating wind chills to 55 degrees below zero. Stronger winds will be here on the western Arctic coast and the colder temperatures over here, but still averaging out to about 55 below for the average wind chill temperature there, but throw some blowing snow in and reduce visibilities on the western Arctic coastal areas. And from there, moving to satellite imagery, you can see one front moving well into Canada here, trailing back into another system moving northeastward in persistent southwest flow. Very wet weather pattern for the Panhandle. And that bringing rain, especially over the southern southeast coast today. Lighter amounts to the north. Rain also on the North Gulf Coast. And then areas of snow over south central Alaska into the Copper River Basin. And out here to the west, kind of a trough up through here and a band extending down into the Kuskokwim Valley toward Iliamna Lake there. And that underneath that, about 1 to 2 inches of snow fell during the day today. And anywhere from a ½ inch to 1.5, maybe 2 inches fell over areas of south central Alaska on up to the north in the Sitna Valley. And mostly cold over the north, or continued cold over not only the north slope, but much of western interior and the Bering Sea. Cold air in place there across the entire Bering Sea, and kind of a weak system right here, bringing some persistent light snow. In fact, this whole area here, cloudy skies with persistent light snow falling over the Bering Sea. It gets a little more showery here as they pick up some clearing there. And then a weak system there near Adak with some snow showers associated with that. And with some clearing today over Kodiak Island. Also some clouds around the area there. And that due to this system kind of nudging its way northward there, bringing the clouds up into the island. Main push here, as you can see, off to the northeast. On the chart, there's the frontal position earlier today, right about in that area there. About 1/3 of an inch of precipitation fell at Ketchikan during the day today, only 1/10 of an inch at Juneau, as I mentioned, and about 1/3 of an inch of rain falling in the Cordova area, some snow in Valdez and south central Alaska. Not much getting up to the Alaska range, definitely not much to the north there, just mostly cloudy skies. But snow along this band here to the west from the Kuskokwim Valley, again 1 to 2 inches of snow there. On up across the Kobuk Valley into Kotzebue, Seward Peninsula, some light snow. And lighter winds here over the Bering Sea today, down to about 15 miles an hour out of the northwest now at St. Paul Island. And winds 15 to 25 miles per hour this, currently here over the Alaska Peninsula, even lighter out over the central and western Aleutians. And for tonight, winds continue to lighten up, not much of a gradient at all, kind of the calm before the next storm, which is right there on the edge of the chart. So wind-wise, pretty good conditions out here over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, even the winds coming down for the Alaska Peninsula. Low pressure now moving back into the Gulf of Alaska. That's going to start increasing the northwest winds here along the western Alaska Range, southern Cook Inlet, Kodiak Island late tonight. Trough with snow to the northwest there, all the way up into the Kobuk Valley and the northwest coast. And snow into the Copper River Basin, maybe some snow showers getting up around the Yukon Flats Eagle area. And this front pushing up to the coastline there. Rain, periods of rain along the coast, rain and snow up to the north there with the higher elevations. Looking at tomorrow, very tight gradient now here. That's going to be bringing storm force winds into Kamishak Bay, the Barren Islands, Shelikof Strait, with gales elsewhere there, southern Cook Inlet. And winds stay light here out over the northern and eastern Bering Sea. Widespread area of light snow and snow showers over just about all of interior Alaska, but clearing out here for the southwest coast. Stays wet for the Panhandle, dry from the Brooks Range to the Arctic coast. And big increase in the winds coming in late tomorrow afternoon for the Aleutians with increasing snow with that. Otherwise, light snow continues for the Pribilofs with light variable winds now. And then for Monday, that low center tracks slowly eastward and starts to weaken now after reaching its maximum strength overnight Sunday night. And by afternoon, it'll begin to fill, but still very tight gradient here. Blowing snow for the Pribilofs, maybe blizzard conditions there. And very strong winds, maybe gusts of 70 miles an hour, Adak and Atka out of the northeast. Mixed rain and snow with this front into the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Snow for the areas farther to the northeast here. Some light snow should at least make landfall by later in the afternoon on Monday. Interior drying out here, especially in the southwest areas up in toward the Seward Peninsula. Still some snow showers along this trough here to the north, and then back to the dry conditions for the north slope and the Arctic coast. Rain and snow showers for the Panhandle. And lows tonight in the 30s for the Panhandle, otherwise 5 below to 15 above South Central Alaska, followed by highs. Teens and 20s tomorrow, 30s to lower 40s for the southeast coast. Colder temperatures on Monday morning. Look at the 15 to 20 below coming into Bristol Bay. Lower teens, Kodiak, and 5 to 15 South Central Alaska. 30s for the Panhandle, followed by highs in the 30s. And staying below zero west of the Alaska Range up to the north. Coldest again on the north slope. Everybody below zero. Highs nudging a little above there in the Tanana Valley, Fairbanks area. Followed by lows again, everyone below zero. Coldest on the north slope. Followed by highs, mostly below zero. 5 to 10 below in the Tanana Valley.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Sunday morning, we've got band of IFR from the Seward Peninsula, east-southeast in the central interior, and then down into the Kuskokwim Valley and along the Alaska Range, all the way down to Iliamna Lake. And then more IFR here, Kenai Peninsula, on up into Turnagain Arm, Anchorage, Palmer Eagle River, Matanuska Valley, part of the Susitna Valley, Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, solid IFR for the southeast coast, VFR, southwest interior, northern interior, VFR, all the way out to the Arctic coast, marginal VFR for the Bering Sea and the Alaska Peninsula, and the Aleutians. For the afternoon, some VFR now for the Fox Islands over to almost Adak, otherwise marginal VFR. IFR, southern Alaska here, especially the Kuskokwim Valley, on up into the lower and mid-Yukon River area. Stays VFR up over the Berks Range, North Slope, Arctic Coast marginal. Narrow band of VFR here, St. Lawrence Island, Nunivak Island into Bristol Bay, on down to Kodiak Island. Stays IFR for the Panhandle and North Gulf Coast, but becoming VFR with those strong westerly winds there, downsloping into Bristol or into Prince William Sound and Whittier. Same thing for Seward and VFR over the northeast interior. And then for Monday, marginal VFR with IFR from the North Gulf Coast here, right on up into the Tanana Valley, Brooks Range, North Slope, Central Western Arctic Coast VFR, some marginal VFR here on the east side, and IFR on the east side of the Panhandle, otherwise marginal VFR out to the Pacific, and some VFR, Northern Bering Sea, right on down across Bristol Bay, Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island. Western Alaska Peninsula, marginal VFR quickly becomes IFR over the eastern Aleutians, extending out to Amchitka Island, and then that big area of IFR advancing northeastward here Monday afternoon into the Alaska Peninsula, Pribilofs covering the Aleutians out to about Amchitka Island, and a smaller area of IFR up here over the northwest coast in across Selawik, Kotzebue, and possibly, or Deering. VFR, southern Alaska, looking like could be a pretty good day Monday afternoon here for southern and eastern Alaska. Marginal VFR for a change for the Panhandle. Anatuvik, Natigan, looking good for the Brooks Range, at least those two passes. VFR, flying conditions there. Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR. Rainy, IFR, trending toward marginal VFR. And windy, IFR the entire day, and maybe a little better in the afternoon. Isabel trending better early on, lower conditions, better in the afternoon, becoming marginal. Same trend for Mentasta, as well as Tanita IFR. And Portage, low conditions early on, becoming VFR, especially on the eastern entrance, becoming VFR, probably holding on to lower stuff on the west side, even into the late afternoon. And for Chilcoot White, IFR. Freezing levels at the surface south of the Aleutians here, southeast of Kodiak Island, then up along the North Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle, and 2,000 to 4,000 feet now over the southern southeast coast. Icing, southwest flow here, pushing some considerable moderate rime icing there, kind of moving through by afternoon into the southeast part of the Panhandle. Pretty good over the interior. Maybe a little bit of elevated icing threats here for the Alaska Peninsula. And with that big storm, this area of icing not quite reaching the Aleutians until Sunday evening. And jet stream showing that low I just spoke of right about there at this elevation tomorrow. Otherwise, west-northwesterlies 135 knots from the southeast Bering Sea across the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, diving way to the south there. And pretty light flow at jet stream level over the interior Alaska. Same thing at 9,000 feet, although northwesterlies farther to the north here up to 55 to 75 knots coming across the Bering Sea, and even stronger there up to 75 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And then rolling in strongest winds south of the Panhandle. Gets a little breezy though over the southern southeast coast there, but not too bad. And looking at 9,000 feet or 3,000 feet, light winds for the Panhandle, although northwest 60 knots there off to the west in the southwestern Gulf or southeastern Gulf, and 55 knot northwest winds supporting those storm warnings for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands there for tomorrow. Pretty windy Kodiak Island. And out to the west, stronger winds gradually edging northward, and then moderate turbulence coming up to the west central Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula or Alaska Range down to Kodiak Island.
You guys got everything tied down back there? Yeah. Yep. We're going through the lee of St. Elias, so there might be some turbulence.
Fasten seatbelt sign on.
Well, who am I to tell you what to do?
There are tens of thousands of glaciers in Alaska. Some stunning cliffhangers, others wide glaciers that come down to meet the ocean tides. Some, like this one we flew over in August, are easily visible from low Earth orbit and are mesmerizing from 1,000 feet above, and have trees growing on top of their soil-laden boundaries. Those glaciers, although they represent only a fraction of the world's ice, are contributing much more than their share to sea level rise. Chris Larson and his colleagues have repeatedly measured 220 of them in a small single-engine otter, measuring their height with lasers and their depth with radar, and watching them change from season to season and year to year. But Alaskan glaciers are also different. We're only just figuring out how they all behave. Data from flights like these, part of NASA's Operation Icebridge, can help fill the gaps. Chris and radar specialist Martine Trufer are both from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and both seasoned Alaskan pilots. But they rely on their good friend and legendary bush pilot Paul Kloss and his 35,000 hours in the cockpit to fly the incredibly demanding flight lines the mission requires.
And does it help you guys being pilots too?
I would like to think so, but watching Paul fly and seeing what he does, it's kind of like trying to learn quantum mechanics in kindergarten.
You know, I can fly my airplane around, but just seeing what Paul does in this extremely challenging environment in the mountains while trying to follow a specific flight line at a specific altitude above ground, negotiating winds, topography, maybe occasional low-level clouds that you have to get around, and just managing all that is just several levels above what I could do as a pilot.
Well, I think the first time I came here to this park, I was probably 4 years old with my father. I've been blessed to be able to fly in lots of places in the world, all over the place, actually, almost every continent. I guess I'm always looking for some place that might be better than this, but I haven't found it.
Paul's plane is about 60 years old and is the first single-engine otter ever retrofitted with a 1,000 horsepower engine, which makes takeoffs feel effortless and gives Paul the ability to negotiate wild terrain, which he certainly did during the first 2 incredible science flights of this campaign. And with sunny skies and relatively calm air, we covered 3 vastly different pieces of ice. While Paul fueled up the plane, Chris gave us a preview of the day's science and scenery.
So it has one of the greatest coastal reliefs anywhere in the world. So it's between the ocean and the summit of Mount St. Elias, which is 18,008 feet high. It's less than 10 miles. There's a stupendous amount of mountain right off the ocean. It's hard to beat it anywhere in the world. It might be the prettiest for me. It's absolutely stunning. From here in McCarthy, we'll cross one of the bigger precipitation gradients in Alaska too. Here it's about 10 inches of precipitation a year, and we'll go over to an area where it's on the order of 200 inches per year. So it's from one of the driest parts of Alaska to one of the wettest parts of Alaska in about 45 minutes flight time.
Whoa, that's pretty good.
That's awesome. You want to do Tyndall next?
Sure, where you want?
If the winds are calm now, might as well grab it.
First, we came to the rugged landscape of Icy Bay, which not that long ago wasn't a bay at all. It was filled with ice. Tidewater glaciers in this region can make dramatic advances and retreats as they feed on high rates of snowfall and then retreat as they're melted by warm ocean waters. Like the Tyndall Glacier seen here, most of these glaciers have retreated dramatically over the last 100 years. But nearby Yahtzee Glacier, after years of retreat, is currently the most rapidly advancing glacier in Alaska. Overall, though, the Icebridge Alaska surveys, from the Denali region in the north to the Juneau ice field in the southeast, have documented pretty substantial thinning of glacial ice. Areas seen here in orange and red show between about 10 and 15 feet of thinning per year.
1200.
There's a nice waterfall up there from the hanging ice.
When we very first started profiling this, Paul, this gravel fan and the one in the valley next to it didn't exist.
Yeah, I was going to say,
this was
look at all the good landing spots here.
Yeah,
There's no place to land here before.
no, it was deep water.
After covering several of Icy Bay's glaciers, given that it was time for lunch, just like that, we landed in this unforgettable spot. Flying eastward, leaving Icy Bay behind, we came to the mighty Malaspina, one of the Earth's great examples of a Piedmont glacier that spills out like pancake batter onto a broad plain as it approaches the sea. It surges at uneven intervals, creating dramatic patterns on its surface as it distorts the moraines of rock and soil borne along by the glacier. The Malaspina is less dynamic than the Yahtzee and is only melting at about the average rate for Alaska, but that could change quickly.
It has the potential for being one of the bigger geographic evolutions in Alaska. Certainly My son will be able to witness some big geography changes there. There's potential for it being connected with the ocean through some narrow lagoons, estuaries, which would take a little bit of coastal erosion, but it's not too hard to imagine that where the Malaspina Glacier is now could become a large bay.
The data that Martine's radar provides could reveal how vulnerable the Malaspina is to melting by the nearby ocean. Here we see the radar returns from the surface of the glacier, and here is something that Chris's lasers can't see, the rocky bed of the glacier, giving us both clues as to what's happening under the ice, as well as a measurement of its thickness. Finally, we came to the Yakutat ice field, 300 square miles of absolutely doomed ice perched high in the mountains. Researchers even debate how this ice field came to be at all, since in its current configuration, it's hard to imagine how it could capture enough snow to form glacial ice. And so, even if the Arctic weren't warming faster than the rest of the planet, this area would be likely to melt within a century or two. But with many other glaciers, it's easier to see the connection between a warming planet and ice loss. Thanks to data from IceBridge and other surveys, we now have a good estimate of the current rate of loss from Alaskan glaciers, 75 gigatons a year. While airborne observations over Alaskan glaciers have provided a rich record of change in the area, those efforts are now augmented by NASA's newest ice measuring tool, ICESat-2. With 6 laser beams of its own, and orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes, the satellite will carry on the record of Alaskan change. For their part, Chris and his team will continue to do their surveys for at least the next 2 years, helping to validate the ICESat-2 data and make further detailed observations over the stunning glaciers of Alaska.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis still continuing to move southwestward here slowly, and that'll continue for the next 5 days, continue its southward progression towards St. Paul Island. And from there, looking at coastal water forecasts, pretty brisk southwest winds on the south coast tomorrow here, 30 to 35 knots with seas a little over 20 feet. Northwest to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots for the north coast, south at 20 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, small craft advisory, southeast winds 25 knots. For the day on Monday, west winds 30 knots all along the outer coastline here with seas running anywhere from 22 to 24 feet. Small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots for Clarence Strait, south winds 20 knots for Stevens Passage, back around to the north at 15 knots for Lynn Canal. And for Prince William Sound, north winds 15 knots tomorrow. Otherwise, gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast around Middleton Island out of the north, 35 knots. 45 knot northwest winds for the western North Gulf Coast. Storm warnings here for the Kamishak Bay area, 50 knots out of the west. Northwest 50 knots for the Barren Islands, higher gusts. And west 40 knots, southern Cook Inlet. Northern Cook Inlet, though, southwest at 15. And then for Monday, northern Cook Inlet, light northeast breeze at 10 knots, north 30 knots for southern Cook Inlet. Gales for the Kamishak Bay area now coming down just under storm force at 45 knots. Storm warnings continue for the Barren Islands, northwest 50 knots. And 35 knot gales for the western North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, on down across Middleton Island. Winds will be northwest at 25 knots. And for Kodiak Island, Shelikof Strait, storm warnings, west winds 50, gusts 70 knots tomorrow, west 45, east side of the island. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, west winds 35 knots, west to northwest winds 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for Monday, Kodiak Island, west winds 30 to 40 knots, east 40 knots for Bristol Bay, south to southeast winds 40 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Western Aleutians tomorrow, east northeast winds 45 to 50 knots, and 15 to 35 knot northerly winds for Adak and Atka. Fox Islands, West-northwesterlies 15 to 20 knots. For the next day, gales for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 40 to 45 knots. Storm warnings in the central Aleutians, northerly winds at 50 knots, and north winds 45 to 50 knots for the western Aleutians. And for the southwest coast, Yukon Delta coast, west winds at 20 knots tomorrow. Small craft advisories here for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, northwest 25, seas in the ice-free waters at about 8 feet, northwest 20 for St. Matthew Island, Pribilofs, northwest winds at 20 knots. And for the day on Monday, storm warnings for St. George especially, and probably even St. Paul Island. Northeast winds increasing to 50 knots, northeast increasing to 40 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, northeast increasing to 30 knots for the Yukon Delta, northwest 30 for St. Matthew Island. Pretty light variable winds now up here, St. Lawrence Island in toward Norton Sound. And for the Arctic coast, east side, central and east side, east and northeast winds at about 20 knots for the day on Sunday. Brisk wind advisories here for the western Arctic coast, and then from Cape Thompson to Wales, north winds at 20 knots. Then becoming kind of variable to south at about 10 knots for the Chukchi Sea from Wales to Cape Thompson. Otherwise, east-northeast winds, 20-25 knots, western Arctic coast. Pretty light winds now for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, down to 10 knots from the north and the northeast. And for tonight, again, low pressure tracking right up into the Gulf of Alaska, front pushing wind and rain into the panhandle, snow at higher elevations. Areas of snow here, southern Alaska, right on up to the northwest coast. And a widespread area of light snow, but lighter winds here for the Bering Sea area. Winds on the increase, Kodiak Island, on up into Kamishak Bay, and through the passes of the western Alaska Range. They'll continue to increase, become quite strong in some areas tomorrow, with some blowing snow possible for the western Alaska Range. Again, the storm warnings there for Kamishak Bay, Chillicothe Strait, and the Barren Islands. Gales, southern Cook Inlet. Stays wet over the panhandle. A lot of snow in the interior south of the Brooks Range, clearing out in the southwest coast. And then here's the next big storm, just coming onto the map there, that pushes northeastward to just south of Atka Island Monday afternoon. Some snow may reach the southwest coast in the afternoon. Could be a blizzard for the Pribilofs, rain and snow, and strong winds, especially in advance of that front as it moves into the Alaska Peninsula, drying out over the interior. And
these forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.